You suddenly realize it's only a bit more than 2 weeks until the next event, and you still wanted to add something new to your costume. It's kind of late to start a new elaborate project, so what do? You start on it anyways. Why am I like this? Anyway, here is the process of how I made a leather mask in 2 weekends and a bit. And even better, if you want to make one of these yourself, you can actually get the pattern on my Ko-Fi. You can find the link here. So without further ado, let's get crafting. At first, the idea was to make a full face mask, so I started sketching that. But then I quickly realized it wouldn't work that well because I wear glasses. So the design was changed to be a half mask instead. Aside from that, my pattern making process is one big case of trial and error. Sketch something, cut it out of paper, check what it looks like in a mirror, change things if needed, rinse and repeat till it ends up as something workable. Once you have a paper pattern you like, a good mock-up material for leather is EVA foam. It behaves quite similarly. With this, you can also account for the material thickness. To stick this all together in a non-permanent way, you can use double-sided carpet tape. On the places the pattern doesn't overlap, we can just use the tape as if it was one-sided. The mock-up allowed me to do minor size changes, like giving even more room for my glasses. It also made me realize the chin needed a slightly different shape, and I noticed the strip over my nose would end up uncomfortable. So I ditched that as well. With that we have the plain pattern pieces, but having just those would be boring, right? First of all, it is practical to be able to breathe in a mask, and as this one will be purely decorative anyway, to make it even more comfortable, I started by adding breathing gaps to both the mouth and the nose. Aside from that, the rest was still a bit bare. For this, I decided on a relatively simple raised piece, for which I have some interesting ideas later on. And as it is sort of practical that it can actually hang onto your head, the straps and attachment were patterned next. I saw some other masks that had this particular shape to hold onto your head, and I think it will be more comfortable than a single strap, so that's what I went for. Then it is time to grab the leather. To make it easier to cut, trace around the pieces with a scratch awl. Then you can cut it with any kind of sharp knife, either a dedicated leather knife or a freshly snapped off X-Acto knife. This entire project was made with 1 to 1.5mm veg tan leather, but any kind of non-floppy leather will work for this. If working with the snap blade, don't forget to snap the blade as soon as you notice it dulls and it takes more effort to cut the leather. To save some of the leather, the short straps were cut as much as possible from the leftover pieces. One can even be cut from the inside of the head strap. With all the pieces cut, we can mark the decorations. The hole punch can be used to lightly press where it has to eventually end up. And for the elongated gaps, I press a dot on the outermost edge and trace the center line, so I know how to line up the hole punch later. To mark the placing for the raised cheek piece, you can use a pen on the paper to trace an indent on the leather. We do the same for all the straps with the marking for the buckle inserts and the sizing holes. Then we can start to work with the leather itself. Mark where the stitching lines begin and end, and draw a line with a stitch groover. If you don't have a stitch groover, trace the line with a scratch awl. After that, it is time for the many holes to be punched. For the elongated gaps, you can pre-mark the holes to be punched to make sure they are center and your elongated gap will be nice and straight later. Which is then followed by more whack-a-mole. And even more whack-a-mole for the straps. To complete the elongated gaps, put a ruler between the punched holes that only just touches the outer edge, and cut a line between them. This way you get straight gaps with nicely rounded edges. Then repeat this for the buckle slots. So there we go, I did one big oops. I did not look at my instructions before cutting this. So normally I would redo this entire piece, cut it from leather again. But to be fair, I just don't have the time for this, so we will have to live with it. Good thing is that this will be stuck on top of the other piece in one solid piece, so when I sew this on, I can glue this down. I'm also planning to dye this dark brown, so hopefully this will be less visible again as well. And well, this is LARP gear, so battle damage I suppose? So let's just continue. The next step is to bevel the edges. This is one of the steps I always quite like. It is somehow very satisfying. We do this for all the edges except the front seam on the face part. This so the front seam will be more seamless when stitched together. Then it is time to dye. This time I used the Phoebinks chocolate for all the parts and applied it with a piece of old t-shirt. To later make the dual color effect, I left the cutouts under the cheek piece bare. As the rest of my costume is pretty green, I used a bright acrylic leather paint for the cutouts. The reason I did not dye the chocolate underneath is that I don't have to wait for the dye to dry first, and the green will be brighter and more even in less coats. And please, do color outside the lines. If the cheek piece moves slightly, you won't see unpainted leather peek out from underneath. Then to give the rest a nice uniform look, we can use a paintbrush to dye all the missed bits, indented lines and punched holes. This took quite a bit longer than expected, but it was definitely worth it. I also like to dye the back of the pieces that might be seen, such as straps. In this case, I dyed just the short side straps, but you can choose to do more. Before we can start to put it all together, finish the edges by burnishing them with some tokonole. This is one of those other super satisfying steps, as the edges just end up super nice and shiny. It is also a really nice task to do while catching up on some series. Aside from the edges, also slick the back of the pieces that will either see a lot of friction or can catch onto things. In this case, all of the straps. Then the optional step, fix the miscut with some contact cement. After which, the cheek piece can be glued onto the main face piece. This doesn't have to be super neat. It's just practical to not have it slide around while sewing. I marked the stitch hole with a stitching wheel and pre-punched the holes with a sharp awl. Because this seam is mostly decorative, I opted to go for a single threaded running stitch, and also because this saves some time, which at this point became quite a thing. Then the front seam can be marked and punched. It is also practical to mark and pre-punch the chin stitch line, as right now it can still be easily accessed. And while we're at it, the chin piece itself as well. The front seam was then stitched with spiral stitching. I just like the look of the contrasting thread, and this is a nice way to show that. When you arrive at the top, pull the pieces together with each stitch so the nose forms the rounded shape. To make sure everything ends up symmetrical, start stitching the chin piece from the center. For this seam, I did end up going with double needles, to get the cool double stitch rows, but also to make the seam even more sturdy, as this is the one giving the mask most of its shape. And with that, all of the stitching is done, although I did kind of do another oopsie. I miscounted when punching these stitch holes compared to these. So there's one hole more on this row than there is on this row. But how did I fix it? Well, just doubled up the last stitch. This way there is no leftover single gap at the end here, and yes, you can see that there is something off on this side compared to the rest of the stitch line, but as it is on both ends, it is now a feature. And well, as if there wasn't enough going wrong on this project already, it was only now that I realized I had completely forgotten to cut a piece. The lower hat strap. I did measure for it, but I didn't draw a paper piece, so it was completely overlooked. Oh well, back to the leather. Luckily, the piece was simple enough, and after cutting, hole punching, beveling, dyeing and burnishing, it was time to finally put the mask together. For this, we can insert the buckles into the slots to check if everything is oriented correctly, and then insert the rivets. Yes, these are a tad bit too big for the leather I used, but I just didn't have time to order new ones, so these will do. As rivets are pretty quick to insert, the actual putting it together part was done very quickly. And then, one last optional step. I noticed with the test fits it was quite harsh on my nose, so I glued in a piece of scrap fabric for comfort. One thing to note, do not use a glue for this that hardens, such as super glue, or it will still end up uncomfortable. And with this, we can strap it all together and it is done. Even though it seems Murphy's Law went rampant on this project, I am still incredibly happy with the way this turned out. The mask is relatively simple, but it definitely ended up with the feel that I was going for, and it's pretty comfortable to wear. I'm also quite proud of how the pattern turned out. I think I'm starting to get the hang of this. And between the color choices, the way you can fill the cutouts, and what you do with the stitching, it's pretty customizable too. So if you want to work with it, you can pick it up in my Ko-Fi store. And with that, thank you all for watching, and see you all next time.